Machon Shilo, led by Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, is devoted to disseminating Torah Eretz Yisrael and a vision of what a Jewish existence could be like if we as a nation would resynchronize. We appreciate all of the feedback we've been getting regarding these discussions between Rabbi Bar-Hayim and Yehonatan Pollard. Please continue sending your messages. Welcome again, Yehonatan.
Thank you.
Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Thank you very much. Shalom lechulam. Welcome to all. And particularly to my friend, Jonathan Pollard. Good to see you again.
Same here.
The first thing I wish to touch upon today is something that I became aware of only recently, and that is as follows. Dr. Mordechai Kedar is a well-known Israeli Arabist, a great expert in all things Arab, Middle East affairs, Islam, etc., etc. He was interviewed about 1.5 months ago, in other words, a couple of weeks after the beginning of this current war with our Ishmaelite enemies, in which he mentioned the following. Dr. Kedar published on the 9th of April this year, 2023, according to the Gregorian calendar, an article. This article appeared in his blog on the Israeli website and newspaper known as Makor Rishon, in which he outlined Iran's satanic plan to bring about the destruction of Israel. I should add here parenthetically that this is hardly a secret, that this is what the Iranian regime and at least a significant proportion of the Iranian people wish to achieve. How do we know this? Because they have said so from the very first day of the Iranian Revolution, way back in 1979, that Israel must and will be wiped off the map. The first thing we all have to recognize and understand and internalize and never forget is that they mean every single word that they say. They have always meant, and they continue to mean every single word that they've ever uttered on the subject. The Iranian plan was revealed in detail to Dr. Kedar by an acquaintance or a friend of his. He describes him as being an Iraqi Christian Arab who lives in Europe, who has contacts within Iraq. And he informed him of the following, that the Iranians plan a major multi-front attack on Israel on the same day, at the same hour, from the south, that is to say Hamas, Gaza, from the north, that is to say Hezbollah in Lebanon, and approximately 40 pro-Iranian Shiite militias in Iraq and also in Syria. This attack would begin with an absolute deluge of missiles on the country, with the express aim of depleting Israel's anti-missile defenses, in the immediate wake of which there would be ground incursions on all borders of the country. The idea was to take over certain areas of the country near the northern border, the southern border, eastern border, in the Golan Heights, etc., etc. You can just imagine the number of hostages they would be able to capture in such an operation. And they envisaged that in such a scenario, which would paralyze and cripple the country, Israel would cease to exist as a functioning state within 3 days. This was the plan. Dr. Mordechai Kedar considered with himself for a time whether to publish this information that he received. He decided that it was his duty to do so, and he did so. It was not widely disseminated, not widely referred to, and he also mentions explicitly in this interview, Dr. Kedar, that certain intelligence know-alls who read his article and heard about this plan discounted it, of course, as being impossible because, well, those are Iraqis and these are Lebanese and they're Shiite and they're Sunni, and how could they possibly all work together and coordinate? That was the rationale, apparently. And then Dr. Kedar goes on to explain that the attack that took place on Shmini Asereth, the 8th day or the day that follows the 7 days of Chag HaSukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, the 7th of October, that plan really threw a spanner in the works because they decided to go ahead and do so without prior coordination, against the wishes of the Iranians, who were not expecting and were not aware of this plan to go ahead on that day and attack Israel. And thus, we were actually saved, the Jewish people were saved from a vastly worst case scenario. That, in a nutshell, is what Dr. Kedar wrote at that time. In other words, about 6 months before the attack actually took place. It's now about 8 months ago. And this is what he mentioned in this interview about 1.5 months ago. And now, Jonathan, your thoughts?
Right now, it's hard to say exactly what the nature of the Iranians' simultaneous multi-front war plan actually was. We have reports from various people alleging all kinds of things. You have to look at facts on the ground, though. If you believe in a coordinated, simultaneous, multi-front war, then clearly there was something wrong with what happened when Hamas went first. Some say prematurely. I've heard other reports that said that when they saw the number of civilians at the Nova Beach musical dance event, that they just couldn't resist initiating the attack. I don't know if that's true or not. It's an interesting idea, but I have no way of verifying that. Look, there are two ways of looking at this. First of all, the existence of a simultaneous, coordinated, multi-front war could have been propaganda. It could have been disseminated by Iran basically to scare the heck out of us. Second of all, there is a case could be made that even in such a scenario, having Hamas go first and significantly deplete our air defense arsenal, which they've largely succeeded in doing, and absorbing a very large number of our premier ground forces would fit within a multi-front war, but a phased multi-front war. We haven't seen the end of the beginning if there is going to be a multi-phased war. We haven't seen it yet. Will Hezbollah come in? Well, they can come in a very limited way and have a tremendous effect on our campaign in Gaza as a diversion. We've already seen the Houthis brought into this matter successfully so far. And I have to admit that part of the phase, a lot of us were talking about before the war started, and nobody listened at all. And it's good to remember that our Navy, which is a stepchild to the Air Force and the Army, is woefully inadequate to the task of defending our merchant trade through the Bab el-Mandeb, through the Red Sea and into the Gulf of Aden and beyond to Asia. as far as Hamas is concerned, it was my feeling and the feeling of many others that if we don't preempt them, because war we consider to be a certain inevitability with them, that we should, as soon as possible, wreak vengeance on the Strip, the Gaza Strip, using such weapons as Moabs, which are dropped from transport planes, and they're called the poor man's nuclear weapon. They're broad area weapons that are devastating, not just laterally, but vertically as well. The overpressure is tremendous. And that we must, at all circumstances, avoid a house-to-house urban combat scenario. And that's exactly what the government and the military in particular did not do. They didn't flatten Gaza so that when our soldiers went in, the tallest building they would encounter would be an anthill. This is why we're losing soldiers piece by piece, soldier by soldier, day by day, because we are not, in fact, launching a decisive strike against both Hamas and their civilian supporters. I say civilian in quotes. So when you go back and you try to wonder, did the Iranians understand this? And the answer is yes. They're a lot smarter than we are in these matters. And they understood that even if we did launch some kind of retaliatory ground invasion, it would be tentative. It would come under a great international opprobrium. There would be a lot of problems for us. And in that, they've been successful beyond their wildest imagination. And again, it's an own goal, as they say, by our own military and civilian leaders, this so-called war cabinet, which is anything but that. So I think the Iranians right now have drawn the appropriate conclusions as to how weak and how fragile our government and our military actually is. And so whether it was a phased, simultaneous, multi-front war, or whether it was a phased war, it's all the same. Even if we bring all the troops from Gaza, say the war ended in Gaza right now, and we brought the troops up to the north, all of them. The most I've heard is that the Americans are pushing for a political solution, which is a waste of time. Second of all, should we actually engage in ground combat against the Hezbollah? We only see going up to the Litani River maybe as a war plan. And as a friend of mine, Aaron Lerner, has written, the real threat to Israel comes in the form of Iran's medium-range, precision-guided medium-range ballistic missiles, which are all located north of the Litani. So even if we were to reestablish the South Lebanon security zone with everything that means in terms of ongoing losses from a guerrilla war, the real threat, strategic threat to our vital industries, airfields, and the like, will remain intact for the most part. And once again, we have a classic example of where the military does not deserve the reputation, the high command that is, does not deserve the reputation it somehow has garnered for being the most trustworthy and effective branch of government. The reality is quite the opposite. They and this particular government actually represent more of a threat to our survival than Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Iranians, and the Houthis for that matter, put together. So even if you believe that Hamas jumped the gun, so to speak, it doesn't really matter. At this point, it just doesn't. We'll let the historians figure it out in due time. But for right now, we are badly badly mismanaging this war. And I don't know how it will end, honestly.
Particularly because essentially all members, but particularly one member of the so-called war cabinet, namely Gantz, is essentially an agent of the Americans within the war cabinet.
And put Eisenkot in the same league.
Of course.
And Gallant for that matter. And Bibi right now is only concerned about one thing and one thing alone, and that's being reelected. And he'll do anything to guarantee that. This is not the kind of war cabinet we need right now. Just the opposite.
Clearly not. So
no, and
what you're saying is that we are certainly not in a position to be able to breathe a sigh of relief.
Not quite the opposite. The minute we started engaging, well, the minute I suddenly realized we didn't have a war plan, that we were waiting to be to figure out what we should do, how we should do it, when we should do it, and waiting for the troops to be properly equipped and trained. Now think about this. Then I realized, yeah, we're going to be playing their tune. We're going to be fighting their war plan, house to house urban conflict, which is the very last thing we should be doing right now. The Israeli army, this particular high command, has always favored the expenditure of manpower over creativity. It's unfortunate, but such is the case. They are incapable or unwilling to fight decisively, offensively, and effectively against enemies like Hezbollah that are hiding amongst willing supporters in a densely packed urban environment. I'm sorry.
And that is because, in the first place, because this war cabinet and this prime minister have declared that the main purpose of this campaign is to destroy the Hamas and its military and other capabilities. But that, of course, is total nonsense for the simple reason that this is not a conflict between two organizations or even two armies. This is a conflict between two nations.